Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. A real privilege to be have the opportunity to moderate this session. A couple of quick observations. Clearly, this is a very complex issue. Trying to discuss and decide and analyze what's in everybody's minds. Very, very difficult, if not impossible. So that's my first observation and comment. And I think what's already been established in the two presentations that we've heard is that probably there's no single mindset that can characterize as large a region as Africa. There are over 50 countries. And within that, so many other regions, so many other cultural groups and so on. And I was just thinking to myself, if I change the title of the presentation to Understanding the Asian Mindset, I think we find a very similar kind of challenge. You know, we are here in the middle of Southeast Asia, we have Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand. Just think of those complexities. So to apply that same framework to understanding Africa, I think it will take us that much further. Okay, enough of listening from me. I think, if I may, just to kick things off, I'd like to give the floor, the mic, to my two panelists who haven't yet addressed the audience. So maybe first, I can call on the High Commissioner to just give us maybe 5 minutes of your observations of what you've just heard, and then I'll follow up with Neil after that.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Jaya. Thank you, Yuan, Excellencies, Jaya, and Dr. Biswas. Welcome to Singapore. You know, I came to Singapore as a South African, obviously wondering what is it that I need to do for my 4-year tenure to advance the African cause. And it didn't take me a long time to realize that there's a deficit here that I will probably not be able to help with on my own. I was exceptionally excited when the Center for African Studies was established, because I felt that this is the step in the right direction. Southeast Asia and Africa, we actually do not understand each other at all. And this is why the Chinese and the Indians have made inroads and are well ahead of Southeast Asians. So thank you for the Center for African Studies, Dean. Having said that, I also realized that the Singapore is Southeast is the gateway for Africa into Southeast Asia, in as much as Southern Africa is the gateway into Africa. There's no doubt about that. And it should be easier for Southern Africans to make inroads into Southeast Asia, considering the fact that we're all English speaking, and the Southeast, especially the Singaporean government, have ensured that the Singaporeans are all on par and educated and should understand Southern Africa. I don't really want to talk too much, because I've also come here learning a lot today, and having to sit there and do a little bit of introspection on me as a South African, and Yuan being an Afrikaner. It's been very interesting for me so far. So I will just stop for a minute and give my Neil an opportunity to introduce himself.
Please. I think you have on this panel, you have a unique perspective because you're the only business person on the panel. So I think most of the audience are also from the business sector, so I think they'll be very interested to hear what you have to say.
Yeah. Hello. Welcome, and thank you for inviting me to the panel. I'd like to just make a few comments about how we see, how Indians see Africa, Africa see Indians. I'm third generation Indian in Kenya. I consider myself Kenyan. So we straddle two continents. And over the years, the relationship between India and Africa has evolved. So just to take back history, there are a lot of commonalities between India and Africa, I think, which has been mentioned earlier. The question is, how has these commonalities actually resulted in closer relationship and understanding between India and Africa? I think in the post-independence period, there was a lot of political relationship between India and Africa, but the people-to-people relationship was what was missing. I think India was recognized by Africans as helping them and supporting them in their colonial struggle. But after that, I think people came to believe that India actually represents low quality of governance, low quality of goods, and really was not a model that was used by Africa for its own development. I think this has changed over the last few decades. India has opened up, and I think Africa's views on India have dramatically changed. India is considered tech savvy, India is considered professional, India is considered democratic. I can't say great governances yet, but it's certainly moving in that direction. But I think the country relationships have moved from just being government to people. And I think that's really where the strength lies. It's a people-to-people relationship that makes a difference. African students are studying in India. Indian businesses, not government businesses, unlike China, but private businesses, are investing heavily into Africa. And there is, I think, a great deal of interest and awareness, despite the governments, of a relationship between Africa and India. Africa is very diverse, as is India. So I think Indians have a much better understanding of the kind of challenges that are faced. The issues of regulation, the issues of governance, the issues of diversity are all issues that are well understood in India. So I would say some of the most successful management in businesses all over Africa are from India, because they understand the environment. The environment is in many ways very similar to India. Going forward, I think the relationship is going to get a lot closer, a lot stronger. And India is, I think, making itself and making a strong presence in Africa. Of course, in the resource sector, but I would say more importantly, in the consumer sector. Africans generally believe in brands, but they also want lower costs, affordability. And I think Indian companies which have taken the long-term approach will succeed. Indian companies have been very strong, as we discussed, in the pharmaceutical sector, in the technical sector, the equipment sector, in the telecom sector. But I think this will grow. They find it difficult, I think, to compete in the consumer goods sector because the Chinese, I think, dominate this sector. Even India itself, I think, finds it difficult to compete with the Chinese in these sectors. So I think the business will grow, and I think there will be a lot more interaction. Just to talk briefly about the Indian diaspora, the Indian diaspora should have been the biggest support for India in Africa. But I would say that that support was lukewarm for the first few decades after independence, because the Indian government approach was government to government, was never people to people. And so the Indian diaspora in Africa looked more to Europe and America for their support, for trade, for business. And I think that is now what is changing. You have, groups which are in Africa today, Indian groups, Indian diaspora groups, which have become very strong. Some are based here also in Singapore. But there are also many local groups, and just to talk about a few of the groups, they're well entrenched in Africa, not only in business, but in philanthropy, in various aspects of the local community. And I think there is a lot of potential for these links to grow further. And I think that is what is happening. Coming back specifically, to Kenya, since I represent Kenya, I'd just like to briefly mention, 10 years ago, Indian companies in Kenya were practically non-existent. Indian local companies were very powerful, very strong. You have the IPS group, which I think, the Aga Khan group, which is one of the leading groups in East Africa and throughout Africa, not only in business, but in philanthropy, in social services. A tremendous name in the region. But Indian companies, came with the mentality probably of the 70s, the what we call the Raj mentality in India, where you make a deal, you cut a deal with the government, and you make money, you get high tariffs. You don't really care about the quality and the brand and the product that you produce or the services you supply. Now there is a completely new generation of Indian companies, which are highly professional, highly focused, and I would say are creating a new relationship between India and Africa. These are companies like Tata's, which has been mentioned earlier, companies like, in the telecom space, like Airtel, Bharti Telecom, who have come in a very big way, companies in the mining sector. So I think there is a complete difference now in the approach, the understanding, and Indian products, Indian management is respected and appreciated throughout Africa. And I think that's going to be the real strong foundation for growth in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. I have a couple of follow-up questions, but I'll come back to them in a while. Maybe let me turn attention to what something that Dr. Biswas, you mentioned in your remarks just now. You mentioned that the new generation, the younger generation of Africans that you have come into contact with are not very different from the young people that you teach back home in India. Is this because of two parts? Is this because they have not had gone through the same experience, worldviews that their parents did and their earlier generations did? And does this mean that new companies coming into Africa, dealing with a much younger counterparties, new business owners and so on, do they then adopt a much more similar approach to the market, since everyone is kind of having the same worldview? Millennials dealing with millennials, new entrepreneurs dealing with new entrepreneurs, everyone's being affected by globalization. Does this affect the strategy that companies coming, especially perhaps into new tech businesses, does that have an impact?
Yes, I think that globalization is certainly make an impact here, The people get to know, and it is now the global village. People get to know about this, about the companies, about how they are working, how the African people will react to their products, and how they will behave. So these are the things that it is very much being discussed. So many of and that they get more and more exposure to these companies before they come and established their companies in Africa, in many of the African countries. So they also have that survey. Those are the surveys. Those are very much important. And and the mindset and the young generation mindset, what they are very much telling, they are honest in much what we call the much more honest than the previous generation, and what this and they are being very much open, transparent. So I think it is, yes, of course, the globalization has made a very big, very big, what do you say? Yes, yes, it is a factor that make these the changes, that make all the changes. Yes.
If I may just add, we should never undermine the information. The fact that someone can just take a picture of a WhatsApp in Australia, see what a mining company is doing for an Australian village, and the same mining company has assets in South Africa and does virtually squat for that society. So the youth, the younger generation, they are standing up and they're voicing their dissatisfaction, because at the end of the day, information is knowledge is power. And I think we've gotten Southern Africa, for starters. You have East, North, South, and West Africa. And the continent is huge, as we all know, but the perceptions and the experiences of the Africans in East in comparison to the Africans in South is totally different. And you would find the Southern Africans probably being seen as being radical and aggressive, but if you sit down for a minute and understand the culture and where they come from, and you're really a serious businessman that want to in on the continent, then you need to take cognizance of what had happened to them. I'm not saying you must walk around with their history on your shoulders, but it is there and it's not going to go away. And you have to understand that. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. Just let me take a break now and just take a look around the room. If there are anyone with questions, maybe you can take the first round of questions for any of the panelists. Please. And if you would, just identify yourself, who you are and which organization you represent.
Yes, good morning, and my name is Siri, Nanyang Business School Banking and Finance. From Dr. Biswa's presentation, there have been quite a lot of direct investment into Africa, particularly in the past several years in natural resources. And we saw similar kind of investment in Australia, for example, say by the Chinese, and there was repercussion, negative one, negative sentiment towards this kind of acquisition of their natural resource companies and so on. So my question is whether you have a similar phenomenon happening in Africa, and would that prevent the future investment even in other areas, more diversified area? Would the locals have this kind of negative feelings towards foreign investment, particularly from Asia?
Thank you. I think you are talking about the resource cars, and that is, we are discussed about very, in many places, and various writers are writing on these resource curves. But I want to say that these resource curves and all these things, these are coming from the, sorry to say that is from the Western writers mainly. Because if you think that there are dislocation, I'm talking about not, there are in Niger and other places, dislocation because of this oil and the other investment from the FDI. But I would say that these resource curves and this the recolonization of Africa, all these talks are coming nowadays after that when they see that India, China, emerging countries are being, coming in a way. And if we take a totality, of this investment scenario, if we see this, our Indian and Chinese investments or South Korea's or other emerging economics are very, 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 very low, 0.3% or something, comparing to this, if you see the US and the other Western countries, European countries are coming to Africa. So these things have been writers are writing about mainly the Western nations. I am not talking that it is nonsense, but I say that these are coming because these emerging economics are coming in a very big way, because these emerging economics are being investing in Africa and coming in a big way. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
I'm from the High Commission of Rwanda. Mine is mainly a comment. Because when you see the mindset of Africa, what came in my mind is a writer called Naipaul, V.S. Naipaul. He's from Trinidad and Tobago, and I think now he's living in UK. He has written extensively on Africa, especially in East Africa, sometimes in even West Africa, on Rwanda, Uganda, and the DRC. But he was very, very negative. And I'm happy that now the history has proved him wrong. The other issue is we are talking about the China and the influence in Africa, India and Africa, but we are forgetting to relate it with European, because in all these issues, the Europeans are the ones who are quite losing. I'm referring mainly on services. Rwandese, especially the people who has the rich people, in case of need of to go to the hospital, they used to go to Europe. Not anymore, especially when since the instauration of the euro, now people are going to India, even for studies. We are looking more to India, and for trade we are looking more to China, which is something that we should be proud of. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Excellency. I think I saw him.
Yes, my name is Celestian from Celestian
Okay, take use the mic.
Yes.
Behind you.
Singapore is new to Africa, and it's vice versa. At the same time, we are also not China, and because we are not the way we're not China in that sense, neither are we India in the way that we like to be, because we do not have the historical connections by and large. But there's a little nation, Israel, which we have connection previously through Singapore's founding, and it's now looking at Africa as to go back to Africa. They have now also worked out a relationship with India as the most favored trading nation. Now, taken from Singapore's viewpoint, is there a chance, taking a small nation vis-a-vis in comparison with another small nation, a chance of taking a perspective and going to Africa with a new mindset? Is there a chance for it?
So I need to correct you a little bit. Singapore and South Africa has had relationships for more than 20 years. I'll let you know that Singaporeans used to use South Africa for your pilots because of the correct altitude that they needed to learn how to fly and jump out of aircraft. We've got an old relationship way back. Neglected? Yes, but old, definitely. Secondly, I understand that the Singaporeans are not Indians and they're not Chinese either. I do understand that. But I love the synergies that we have between the two respective countries. As I said, Singapore is the gateway to Southeast Asia, and Southern Africa is the gateway to the rest of the continent. And if we don't see our strengths in that, then I'm going to start worrying. Because we have more similarities and potential to work together, collaborate, to actually for a Singaporean to be successful on the continent. In actual fact, my government has deals where they offer Singaporeans who are a little bit adverse or reticent about coming into the continent, joining them in Singapore and then walking the walk with a Singaporean into the rest of the continent. Thank you.
Johan, yes, please.
I think also when you look at Africa per se, looking at Singapore, 5.6 million people in totality, 740 square kilometers, and you look at Africa, which sort of takes up China, India, US, Europe, you name it, and still has a few bit of area to spare, then it's going to be like that small little dachshund catching the big bus. What does it do with it afterwards? Unless you look at Africa and understanding, but we need to take it one step at a time. And start off in certain areas, and then the end will be understanding what Africa is about and having a presence in Africa. But each one of those countries has its own cultures, mindsets, opportunities, risks. Some of them you stay out of, others you embrace. If you're not there yet, it might be too late. But you cannot look at Africa as one big, large entity and say, here we are, thank you very much. You cannot do that. You need to look at it per country basis and take them one at a time.
Yes. HC, one comment, and then next year.
Hi, I have a few questions. First with Johan. Could you tell me regarding individual and long-term regarding Indian mindset? Because what we see right now is a lot aggressive, and India is also looking a lot more for a long-term relationship as we see in Africa. So I think the figures are a bit different. And for Jai, Peter, I have questions for you also. Could you give me a breakup on the Indian investments in Africa sector-wise? Because you talked about mainly infrastructure, pharmaceutical, and agricultural. And what I understand from agricultural is there's an Indian company which you haven't put in as in plantations. Is McLeod Russell or Williamson Mager or George Williamson as we call it. They're the largest tea plantation company in the world, the largest plantation. And they've gone into Africa in a very large way. They've gone not because they want to buy up, because Africa has come to them. Rwanda is one example where they've come in and they wanted to invest. They wanted a large company which is #1 in the world in management to come and invest for them. So they come in, they've asked McLeod Russell to come in and invest in their country, to do the management for them. Same as they worked in Uganda, they're working in Ethiopia. They're also now in Vietnam. So it's a success story, which is a very low profile company, but #1 in production, tea production globally. And for Neil, on the same thing on Africa, because we're looking at tribal and looking at diversity. They're working in the largest, they're working in terrorists, they worked in very conflict zones. So they know how to work in conflict research and they know how to work in tribal. And regarding CSR, they have a very strong CSR background. So that's one of the reasons what's making them so successful, working across Africa and in Vietnam so far. Thank you.
HC, comment?
Thank you. I just want to make a comment, but I think why we are here today is that we have taken, it's been 7 years since this journey started, to bring awareness of Africa into Singapore. And I think we are at a point where both the businesses, academia, and also the government, I think we all have come together, and I think we recognize that there is a continent out there we have actually completely overlooked in our radar. And I think this journey has brought a lot of results. And particularly, we had very supportive ministers in the Ministry of Trade and Industry who came forward after coming to and visiting Africa. And this is how we began this journey in 2010. Really took one solid big step by having the inaugural
Africa Singapore Business Forum. And since then, we have been having it biannually. And the next one, I think, is coming very soon in August. Maybe they want to expand on that. But every time we have moved in this forum to different agenda, different topics, and we have brought Africans to Singapore. And for Singapore companies, with that first-hand experience and what Panel is talking about, to bring Singaporeans closer to Africa. We haven't finished on the work. The work is still a long ways off because this must translate into transactional numbers somehow or later. But Singapore companies are already there in Africa. The very big marquee names, Wilmar, then you have PIL, we have Olam, we have another Singapore company called Polaram, of course, Comcraft is already there, and another company called Indorama. And there are so many. And if you, since I am Singapore's High Commissioner to Nigeria, I know there are many Singapore smaller companies operating in maybe consumer electronics, automobile car parts, spare parts, and many other things. And they're all real entrepreneurs who've been there for 20 years, some of them. You know. So I think there are a lot of Singaporeans out there, and I am not so sure what our total investment in Africa is, but from my back of the envelope calculation, we are somewhere in around maybe $15 billion, around that much there. So Singapore is a small country, we have a significant footprint, but I think we can do more. And I think the Africans, when they come to Singapore and when they interact with our leaders and through SBF and IE Singapore, they really want to engage us. But I think the problem is that Singaporeans need to get out from their comfort zones and go to this continent. It's not easy. It's quite challenging. You have heard all the sort of caveats, so to speak, in put forth. You know. But there are opportunities, but you have to stay in Africa, work in Africa to get full benefits. You cannot do by remote control. I thought I would reassure you that Singapore is engaging, but we're taking baby steps, we're not taking quantum leaps. But I think there is a need to understand, as all the panelists and the speakers have spoken, understand the culture, the mindset of that.
Thank you, Chief. Johan, you take the first question.
It has to do with individualism and long-term orientation. If you compare India relative to Africa, it has a more individualist approach relative to the two African countries. This is according to Austria. When you compare India, however, against the US, they are much more individualistic in the US than India would be. But yes, so if you bring all four parties together, Nigeria, Kenya on the one hand, India on the other hand, and if you have a third hand with the US there, I think India would be better off, given the fact that it is sort of halfway down the scale, to better understand India, rather Africa and Africa's countries than the US would. That's on the individualist sort of community orientation. On the long-term orientation, India's more long-term than both India, Kenya and Nigeria on the one hand, and the US on the other hand. So from that perspective, yes, it has a long-term orientation, which is not negative, longer than the other parties, which is to its benefit, because it sees a long-term and it doesn't necessarily count against it. What is important is that they understand that there's a much shorter-term orientation in Africa, and they need to plan for that. And based on the evidence, it does seem clearly that they do understand that, and that they are working this issue to their benefit and their advantage.
Thank you. Thanks, Johan. Dr. Biswas, would you like to take the second question on the breakdown of India?
Breakdown of these Indian companies I don't have with me now this thing. But I want to say that in agriculture front there is a new type of investment there. Now these Africans are giving 45 years lease for their agricultural land, and they are asking these companies, private companies, to come and invest there. So many Indian companies are there in Karturi and other. They are being in the in plantation fields, in the cash crop fields, in the horticulture, and they are making the big business. Also, there are some, people are talking about this land grab and other thing. But in one of my projects which I did on Indian private agro investment in Zambia, I think that they are investing in a very lucrative areas. And in Ethiopia and Kenya, many of these the government are giving the land on lease, and so that is also an important sector that India is going to. Pharmaceutical sector is yes, and they are doing a very wonderful work in bringing down the price of important drugs, and which is very difficult for them when the big multinationals are operating in African, most of the African countries.
Thank you. Neil, there was a third part to that question. You take it.
Yeah, I think the opportunities for plantation and particularly on tea and related plantations remains very large, and I think Indian companies have the management skills. I'm sure even many of the multinational companies like Unilever, who are in plantations in Africa, use actually Indian management to run the plantation. So as I mentioned earlier, I think one of the big skills one of the big advantages that India has in being able to interact with Africa is because they have management which understand the kinds of issues, problems, regulations, diversity that exists in Africa.
Just a point that Unilever sold the plantation because there's a rebate, so we can't no plantations in India. They sold the plantations.
Neil, if I may just put you on to ask you another couple of questions. The first is, just out of curiosity, Comcraft now, as I think you mentioned, has been in Kenya and Africa now for 3 generations. So the first part of the question is, do you now, when you look at, and you're operating across a number of African countries, both East, West, South, when the company now looks at an opportunity in Africa, do you do it through an Indian lens or an African or / Kenyan lens? That's question number 1. And question number 2 is really as a kind of your observation and maybe follow-on advice. You come into contact with lots of Singapore firms, large ones, small ones. Using the experience of Comcraft, in moving into these different countries, establishing and winning business and being successful, what kind of advice would you give to the Singapore firms, really to be able to better do this, to understand the mindset of the countries that they're operating in Africa? 2 parts.
So, the first part, how do we look at investments in Africa from a Kenyan or Indian mindset? Neither. Today we look at investments from an international perspective, but I would say an international perspective with a slant towards history. Because we are from Africa, obviously we look at opportunities in Africa, probably less commercially than I would say otherwise, because we have a certain connection and interest in Africa. We look at things from an Indian mindset. I don't think so, and probably we never have. I think we have always been looking at things from an African mindset initially, and moving towards probably a more international mindset. Your second question is, what is it that Singapore companies can do in order to learn about these markets and enter these markets in Africa? My suggestion to Singapore companies is that you need to work with local parties to understand the complexities of Africa, of each country in Africa, and so different. If to try to do it on your own, unless you're prepared to move to Africa and spend many years of your life there, it's very difficult, it's very challenging. you need to really work with people in those countries who have the local understanding of how to engage local customers, consumers, regulations, government authorities in order to penetrate the markets.
Yes, please.
First, thank you so much for organizing this session. It's very informative. I'm Robert. I'm working as a part-time adjunct researcher with Johan at the Center for African Studies. My question is about how is IE Singapore, the government agency IE Singapore, prioritizing which territories in Africa to build up greater linkages with? So for example, in the case of setting up the office in Ghana, 2014, was that more reactive to existing trade and investment with West Africa, or was it more proactive in the government having an assessment this is where the opportunity is and encouraging greater economic cooperation with the region? And the second part to this question, why was West Africa prioritized over East Africa, and at what point would IE Singapore consider establishing a presence in East Africa? Thanks.
Are there any other questions? Then we can take them in groups. Any last questions?
Hi, I'm Eliza. I'm with the adjunct with NTU. Just a question for the panelists in terms of social capital, right? In terms of transparency and trust, you mentioned all that. And the question is, when you're looking at brand Africa, individual countries, etc., could you comment a little bit about the issue of trust in promoting business?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Alex from Educare. I'm in the education business, and recently we are working with a local partner in South Africa to go into South Africa. With the help of IE Singapore, we're going there next month. So I would like to understand, working with a local partner, what would be the greatest difficulty in understanding a culture or the values or the working processes of a South African local partner, and as well, what would be their greatest difficulty in trying to understand how we work? Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. Could you explain, because we talked about tribalism, could you explain a bit on tribalism in Africa, because Africa is very much a tribal society.
Okay. Perhaps I can direct the question, actually the two questions. The first one was on, well, I'll take the IE question right at the end. Brand Africa and how do you build trust in the country brand. And the second one on doing business specifically in South Africa with local partners. Maybe I can give the floor to Excellency to answer. No, I'll take that one.
I want to thank you for being brave enough to go out to South Africa. I want to also cushion your plans a little bit and let you know it's not going to be that bad. We do have an airport. You will not find a line at the door for anything as gross as Western media has put out. And I may sound like I'm shooting myself in the foot by saying this, but I'm actually one of the few people. I'm happy that we're having a situation where we have to review our whole outlook and not just focus on commodities, prices of gold, diamonds, platinums, etc., etc., etc. It is important, but if we haven't gotten to a point where we grow our people, it doesn't matter how much gold you have, it doesn't matter how much oil you have, if your people do not know what to do, if there's a knowledge deficit, they are just messed up. It's going to be a generational thing. So I was talking to the lady from the institution, and I told her that if there's one thing that's amiss, it's education in South Africa. We can never ever cap it. We have institutions, but we need to multiply them. So anyone who has a mindset to leave someone else with a little bit more knowledge is embraced by me. If IE doesn't help you enough, please feel free to come to the embassy and I'll pave the way for you, because that's our only way forward. Thank you. Yes, trust. We're having conversations with Johan all the time about reputation and trust and image. And South Africa has not done well in that aspect. Or I don't want to play the game blame, because I think, again, when we take ownership of our flaws, then there's hope for us to improve our characters. And it is true that if a country cannot be perceived as being open, transparent, have integrity, it's very difficult to attract businesses or even institutions, because they will go with this mindset that, ooh, it's not going to be okay for me out there. We are a country that is a work in progress. You have to remember that I'm not making excuses, but we're only 21 years old. And having said that, we've gotten to a point where we need to take stock of our flaws and fix it. And trust is one of those ones. Luckily, we've got a constitution that does not allow for someone with a bad character to sit on a chair forever. He has to go, or she has to go. If you cannot walk your talk, you will go. We don't have a constitution that has many leaders staying there and not managing the country. I want to believe that this is the way that will clean our slate. Thank you.
Thank you, H.C. Let me try and address Robert's question here. The first one was, how do we decide how does IE Singapore decide where to place our offices? It's a combination of approaches. Obviously we go through some kind of an analysis using all kinds of indicators and so on. Also, it does differ from region to region. And if you take the case of Africa, which is physically a very, very large space, and we don't have the resources to open up 20 offices. We know that. So then we start looking for hubs that could serve as launch points for certain sub-regions. So in Africa today, we have two offices. The first office we opened was in South Africa, in Johannesburg. And that office serves as an office for the Southern African coast. Not just an office for South Africa, but for the region around it. Likewise for Ghana, or the Western region. And your question, whether or not we will open an office in East Africa, the answer is yes. The second part is when. I will have to get back to you on that one. Sooner than later, I hope. Why West Africa first before East Africa? Or maybe there's another question in there, which is, do we look at how, what's the density of Singapore companies in the place before we decide to put up an office, or do we go ahead and then try and build a business for the Singapore companies? Again, if you look at our network of offices, it's a mix of both. But in the case of Africa, I think it will be the latter, meaning I think we will be, in most cases, playing a forward game. So trying to build awareness and then try and bring more businesses in. Johan.
I would just like to add a bit on the issue of trust. Stephen Emard Covey wrote a book on the speed of trust. And basically he spells out that it's about the roots of the tree as well as the fruits thereof. So if I say to you, good morning, you look to the east and the sun is there and you do it consistently, and every time I say good morning, the sun is there, you get to trust me. But it's also about how we get to do things. If you go, for example, to Burundi, and you look at Pierre Nkurunziza now has changed his country's constitution to stand for a third term. The way that is done has created chaos, mayhem, and violence, a lot of conflict in Burundi. You look next door towards Rwanda. Paul Kagame has also now changed the constitution. But how did he do it? Totally different from the route that Pierre Nkurunziza did it. And so the trust is there. Interesting enough, you would find some Western countries not have a lot to say about Pierre Nkurunziza. not having a lot to say about the 30 years that Museveni has been in charge of Uganda, but does have a lot to say about Paul Kagame in Rwanda. So that is an interesting dynamic that at times you ask, where does this come from? But that's the issue on the side.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I think we are right on schedule, but maybe if I could just invite any last comments to the panel, if any. Neil, any last comments?
Just general advice. Africa is very big and vast, as I think many speakers have said. So, like IE has done, I think finding the right countries to start with and right sectors that you want to really focus on is key to doing business in Africa.
See?
This gentleman touched a little bit on tribalism. I think we didn't actually answer you. South Africa, like the rest of the continent, has tribes. I come from the Zulu tribe, but my tribe has got nothing to do with how I do my work. The country is, as I said, almost 22 years old, and I think what is never going to go away is the tribalism. You'll find it in the 9 provinces. You'll find some of the provinces less tribal than the others. But it would be foolhardy to come from Asia and just ride yourself shit-shot over the tribal values. And probably this is why the panelists and ambassadors said that you have to understand the country and understand the local values and the tribal norms. Perhaps I could comfortably or safely say that South Africa is not really that bad. You will get into a situation where a tribal event is explained to you, but it does not override the governance of the constitution. Not really. But I would want to say that our tribalism is what makes us interesting. Because if you stay long enough in Southern Africa and you get to see the differences between the tribes, they are there. But when you sit down, actually, you'll see that the more we think we actually are different, the more we are the same. Take our languages for a minute. There's everybody says you sound so different because we're one of the ones that makes that sound. It's in Nguni, but if you understand if you stay amongst the group for about 3 months, I promise you'll understand the rest of Southern Africa very quickly. It's not that difficult. It's just whether you want to understand it. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Bismarck, last comment?
Very small, brief comment. That one of the sector, coming to the sector that we're discussing here, that one of the sectors that India and China is very, very much involved in the infrastructure sector, which Africa wants, and which so many years of the colonial rule they have not been made. If you go to the Africa, everywhere you'll see these big roads and these stadiums. Then flyovers, they are made, been built by India and China. I think that of the sector is a very lucrative and that is that Africa needs at this moment. Thank you.
I would just like to sort of comment or add to what Ambassador Hassanbai had to say about Singapore and Africa. If you have a look at today's newspaper, the Business Times of today, front page, the need for Singapore to internationalize. And the article actually refers to 2 elements. The one has to do with the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which for Singapore is maybe not that much new because of the fact that you're probably already in quite most of those countries already. But what I found heartening was that the new CEO of Sabana Jurong International, Mr. Teo, made the point that yes, Southeast Asia still is focus on China. However, he finds Africa attractive for the simple reason, amongst others, that SJ has just won 2 contracts in Gabon and Ghana to do their master planning and to develop their cities. The one that went in, I see my good friend smiling there with Sabana Cooperative Engagement. Am I right with the name? Singapore, sorry, not Sabana. But Sabana and Singapore, SCE, are in it together. I think that was the Ghana one or the Gabon one, doesn't matter. But the point is that Singapore is or has the competencies that Africa has a dire need for. Not only in terms of urban planning, in master planning, but also in energy, in transportation. When I'm back in Africa, people ask me, Johan, how's Singapore? I say it's scary. They say, what do you mean scary? They say, scary how efficient they are. If you have a look at housing, transportation, energy, you name it, Africa can learn from that. So at times, please go and knock on the door. If they don't want to open, kick it open. They just don't know it, but they need you.
On that very encouraging and forceful tone, allow me to please join me in thanking this very, very distinguished panel for really enlightening us this morning.